In August 1943, the engines began to turn before dawn across the concrete and steel of eastern England, a sound that rolled low and steady and did not stop, a sound that meant the decision had already been made and that the moment had arrived. And as the sun lifted behind broken cloud, the heavy bombers of the United States Army Air Forces moved one by one toward the runway with the slow inevitability of loaded weight, each aircraft carrying men, fuel, bombs, and a mission that could not be undone once a certain line in the sky was crossed. Because this was the summer when American air power believed it could break Germany in daylight. And this was the day chosen to test that belief at its outer limit. The mission that planners in the 8th Air Force called Operation Point Blank, but that crews would remember simply as the long run, the deep run, the one that went farther than anything before it. The combined strike against Regensburg and Schweinfurt designed to shatter German aircraft production by hitting factories that built fighters and ball bearings, targets so important and so heavily defended that the distance itself became a weapon against the men flying toward them. And on the morning of August 17th, the sky over East Anglia filled with B-17 flying fortresses from the 1st and 3rd Air Divisions, 4-engine aircraft that looked solid on the ground and fragile once airborne, lifting off in sequence from bases like Bassingbourn, Molesworth, Thorpe Abbotts, and Kimballton, climbing slowly as crews adjusted mixtures and watched the gauges, feeling the familiar vibrations settle into their bones as the English countryside slid away beneath the wings. And the plan, carefully drawn and tightly timed, called for the force to split, the Regensburg group under Colonel Curtis LeMay turning southeast after bombing and continuing on to North Africa, while the Schweinfurt group would turn back to England, forcing German fighters to choose, forcing them to chase one formation or divide against two, a strategy born of necessity because American long-range fighter escort could not yet follow the bombers all the way to the targets and back, because the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning had limits, and beyond those limits, the bombers would be alone. And the man in those aluminum aircraft understood that, even if they did not say it out loud, because they had flown missions before, because they had seen flak bursts and contrails and burning planes, because they knew what it meant to go deep into occupied Europe in daylight with no place to hide. And still, the formation tightened as it crossed the English coast. Still, the navigators confirmed headings and the bombardiers checked their northern sights. Still, the radio silence held as the sea passed beneath them and the first thin line of continental coastline came into view, a gray edge under broken cloud that marked the transition from relative safety into defended airspace. And at altitude, the temperature dropped and oxygen masks came down, voices sounding flat and distant through rubber and microphones, while the bombers climbed to their assigned levels, 20,000 feet and higher, forming boxes designed to concentrate defensive firepower, each aircraft relying on the others, each gun position manned, each .5 caliber weapon checked and rechecked, not for attack, but for survival, because the doctrine was clear and uncompromising. The bombers would fight their way through if they had to. They would not turn back. They would not break formation unless forced. And once the North Sea fell behind them, the landmass of Europe stretched ahead. The sense of distance changed. The sense of time compressed and expanded at once, because every minute closer to the target meant 1 minute farther from home. And the men watching the clouds slide past their windows understood that fuel consumption and navigation were now more than calculations. They were commitments. And at this early stage of the mission, the Luftwaffe had not yet appeared in force, though radar stations along the coast had already tracked the incoming streams, German controllers already plotting interception points. Because this was not a surprise in the absolute sense, it was a challenge issued openly. American bombers in daylight over Germany. And as the formations moved inland over occupied territory, the first flak batteries began to range them, black puffs appearing at a distance, not yet accurate, but close enough to demand attention, close enough to remind every crew that the defenses were layered and patient. And the aircraft pressed on, engines steady, formations adjusting for wind drift, because the schedule mattered, because the separation between the two bomber forces mattered, because if the timing slipped, the entire logic of the mission could collapse. And already small delays had crept in.
Fog over some English bases that morning had staggered takeoffs, forcing adjustments in the air, forcing commanders to decide whether to wait and regroup or to proceed as planned. Decisions made not in comfort but in vibration and cold, with fuel gauges ticking downward and radio silence complicating coordination. And it was here, over Central Europe, still some distance from the first major target, that the reality of the plan began to tighten around the crews, because the escort fighters that had met them earlier were nearing their turn-back points, the thunderbolts and lightnings rocking their wings in brief signals of farewell before peeling away, leaving the bombers to continue alone. A moment that repeated itself across the formation, each group watching the escorts depart, each crew knowing that from this point forward, every mile flown was flown without cover, that the German fighters waiting ahead could attack at will, and that the route chosen would carry them deep into Reich airspace, where replacement crews and replacement aircraft were close at hand for the defenders but far away for the attackers. And still, the formation pressed on.
Because there was no alternative that preserved the mission, and because turning back without orders was unthinkable, and because the point of no return was not a single line on a map, but a gradual narrowing of options that had already begun. As flak grew thicker and more accurate, bursts walking toward the formation, rocking aircraft with concussion even when they did not hit, shrapnel rattling against fuselages like hard rain, gunners tracking puffs and empty sky, eyes straining for the first glint of enemy fighters. And inside the lead aircraft, navigators checked their charts and clocks again, confirming that they were still on time, that the separation between Regensburg and Schweinfurt forces was holding, because the success of the mission depended on German confusion, on forcing split responses, and any delay now would carry consequences later. And as the bombers crossed deeper into Germany, the land below shifted from patchwork farmland to industrial regions threaded with rail lines and rivers, visual markers that confirmed the approach to areas the Luftwaffe would not concede lightly. And still, no massed fighter attack had materialized, a fact that unsettled as much as it reassured, because experience had taught crews that the absence of immediate resistance often meant preparation elsewhere. And the men at the guns tightened their grips and adjusted their seats, scanning high and low, left and right, because the first attack often came fast and without warning. And the bombers continued on, their course fixed, their altitude steady, their fuel margins shrinking with each mile, moving toward targets that could not be reached without committing fully to the long run ahead. And as the lead elements approached the vicinity where the formations would begin to separate for their respective targets, the sky ahead showed signs of heavier defense, flak concentrations increasing, bursts appearing in patterns rather than isolated shots, and radio operators listened intently for any change in orders, any signal that might alter the plan. But none came, and the bombers flew on into a tightening envelope of resistance, engines droning, contrails stretching behind them like lines that could not be erased. And it was at this moment, with the formations committed, the escorts gone, and the first distant specks beginning to appear against the bright high sky ahead, that the mission crossed from planning into irreversible action. Because those specks were growing, multiplying, resolving into shapes that meant interception had begun, and there would be no turning back now. The specks ahead resolved rapidly as the bombers closed the distance, becoming twin-engine fighters climbing hard from below and ahead. Bf-109s and FW-190s vectored precisely into the bomber stream by ground controllers who had been tracking the approach since the coast. And the first attacks came not as a single overwhelming blow, but as a series of probing passes. Fighters approaching head-on at closing speeds that left only seconds for gunners to track and fire. Yellow engine cowlings and dark crosses flashing past the noses of the lead aircraft. Cannon shells tearing through the airspace between formations, some striking home with sharp metallic cracks that shuddered through aluminum frames. Others passing close enough to leave crews flinching inside oxygen masks. And immediately, the carefully ordered geometry of the bomber boxes became a living thing under stress.
aircraft edging closer to maintain overlapping fields of fire, wingmen correcting position as prop wash buffeted them, while formation leaders fought the instinct to maneuver violently, because discipline was survival and breaking formation invited destruction. And as the German fighters pulled through and away, they climbed to reposition, circling back for repeated passes, because fuel and ammunition were plentiful on their side, and because the American bombers could not accelerate or outclimb them, could only endure. And endure they did. Gunners calling out attacks over intercoms, tracers stitching the sky, spent casings rattling across floors, while navigators kept eyes on charts on landmarks, refusing to be distracted, because drifting off course now would not only threaten the bombing run, but could scatter the formation into smaller, more vulnerable elements. And all the while, the flak intensified as the bombers passed near defended cities and industrial complexes. Bursts coming closer, some directly in front of aircraft, forcing pilots to fly straight into black clouds of shrapnel because swerving would break formation, because the only safe direction was forward. And in several aircraft, the first casualties occurred. Not dramatic, not visible from outside, but sudden silences at gun positions, oxygen systems punctured, control cables nicked, injuries that reduced crews by one man at a time, forcing others to move, to take over positions, to adapt under pressure. And still, the formations pressed on, the Regensburg force beginning to edge toward its planned turn southeast, the Schweinfurt force holding course deeper into Germany. And this divergence became a focal point for the Luftwaffe, because the defenders now understood the plan, because reconnaissance and radar reports confirmed that one bomber stream was not turning back, that it was heading for targets far beyond the usual penetration depth. And this realization sharpened the German response, concentrating fighters where they could inflict the greatest damage before the bombers reached their objectives. And so the attacks intensified, waves of fighters coordinating slashing frontal assaults, followed by rear attacks aimed at stragglers, aircraft that had slipped slightly out of position due to damage or turbulence. And the cost of even minor damage became apparent. A single engine losing power meant increased drag, reduced speed, and the immediate threat of falling behind the formation. And crews fought desperately to keep damaged aircraft in place, pilots coaxing wounded engines, engineers adjusting mixtures and feathering props only when absolutely necessary.
Because losing speed meant losing protection, and losing protection meant drawing the full attention of the enemy. And one by one, aircraft began to drop out, some slipping downward on the control, others suddenly engulfed in smoke as fuel lines ruptured or fires took hold. And though the narration of this moment in later years would often focus on individual heroism, in the air it felt impersonal and relentless, a grinding contest of endurance measured in minutes and miles, where the question was not whether the formation would be attacked again, but whether it could absorb the attacks long enough to reach the target. And as the bombers flew on, the separation between the two forces widened. Regensburg aircraft beginning their long southeast arc toward Austria, Schweinfurt aircraft continuing straight into the heart of Germany. And this split did indeed force the Luftwaffe to divide its efforts, but not evenly, because the Schweinfurt force, destined to turn back the same way it came, represented a target that would remain within reach of German fighters for much longer. And this calculation shaped the next phase of the battle, as additional interceptor groups were committed against the Schweinfurt stream, aircraft taking off from fields further east and north, climbing to altitude with the advantage of fresh pilots and full ammunition loads, while the American bombers, already under sustained attack, felt the cumulative effects of stress and attrition. And yet, the mission clock continued to tick forward, and soon the landmarks that marked the approach to Schweinfurt itself became visible through haze and scattered cloud. The main river, rail yards, factory complexes, and here the flak reached the density unlike anything most crews had yet experienced, because Schweinfurt was a priority target ringed with heavy anti-aircraft guns, their crews trained and experienced, firing in coordinated barrages designed to bracket bomber formations, and the sky filled with black bursts that seemed almost continuous, forcing pilots to fly straight and level through an environment where the air itself felt hostile.
And it was during this approach that the bombers began to take their heaviest punishment. Aircraft rocked violently by near misses, fragments punching holes through wings and fuselages, instruments flickering or failing, and in several cases bombs were jettisoned prematurely from damaged aircraft unable to maintain altitude. A loss that weighed heavily because every bomb mattered to the mission's strategic purpose. And yet, the order to proceed remained unchanged because the objective was within reach, because turning back now would waste everything already endured. And so the bombers lined up for the bomb run. A moment that demanded even greater discipline, because once the bombardier took control of the aircraft through the bomb site, the pilot surrendered maneuvering authority, committing to a straight and steady course that maximized bombing accuracy, but also made the aircraft more predictable, more vulnerable. And this commitment was made across the formation, one aircraft after another locking onto the target area, bomb bay doors opening, creating additional drag, while the flak reached a crescendo, bursts walking directly through the formations, tearing gaps that had to be closed instantly by surviving aircraft. And still, the bombs fell, long strings of them dropping toward factories whose importance had been calculated months earlier by planners far from the smoke and noise of the moment. And the sight of bombs leaving racks brought a brief, sharp sense of release, because it meant the primary task had been completed, because it meant the reason for the suffering had been fulfilled. And almost immediately after the last bombs were away, the formation began its turn. Pilots banking as ordered, crews watching the target area slide behind them. And this was the moment when some expected relief, when instincts suggested the worst might be over. But the reality was harsher because the Luftwaffe attacks did not diminish, they intensified. Fighters striking as the bombers turned and lost formation integrity for precious seconds. And the flak, though now behind them, had already done its work, leaving many aircraft damaged and struggling. And now the long journey back began. A journey made longer by headwinds, by damaged engines, by reduced formation strength, and by the knowledge that escort fighters would not meet them for many miles. And it was here, on the withdrawal from Schweinfurt, that exhaustion began to take hold. A deep, cumulative fatigue that slowed reactions and dulled senses even as the danger remained immediate. Gunners tracking targets with aching arms, pilots fighting to maintain altitude with compromised power plants, navigators recalculating routes around weather and known flak zones, because the return path could not simply retrace the inbound course without adjustment. And the German fighters understood this as well, attacking from the rear and from below, exploiting blind spots, pressing attacks against aircraft already wounded. And the losses mounted not in a single catastrophic moment, but steadily, aircraft disappearing from the formation one by one, leaving gaps that had to be filled. And as the miles passed, the realization spread through the surviving crews that the mission was not yet over in any meaningful sense, that survival still depended on holding together for hours more, and that fuel, always a concern, was becoming critical for aircraft forced to fly at inefficient settings due to damage. And while the Regensburg force continued south toward bases in North Africa, facing its own challenges of fuel management and navigation over the Alps, the Schweinfurt force turned west, still deep inside enemy territory, still under attack, and the point of no return, long crossed in planning terms, now asserted itself physically, because damaged aircraft no longer had the option of diverting easily, because friendly territory lay far away, and every decision now carried immediate consequences. And as the formation pushed on, thinner and more ragged than before, the sky ahead showed no sign of easing, only the long, uncertain path back toward the English coast, and the next hours would decide whether the surviving bombers could endure what still lay ahead.
The attacks did not end with a turn away from Schweinfurt. They deepened, because now the German fighters no longer needed to rush to break up a bombing run. They could focus entirely on destruction, choosing targets already weakened, pressing attacks methodically. And the American formations, reduced and uneven, felt the full weight of that shift. because defensive fire depended on mutual coverage, and every missing aircraft widened gaps that could not be fully closed. And as the bombers moved westward, the sense of time stretched unnaturally, minutes feeling like hours as each new cluster of fighters appeared out of the sun or climbed from below, their tactics refined by months of engagement, head-on passes followed by stern attacks, cannon fire aimed at cockpit and wing roots, areas known to cripple without immediate explosion. And inside the bombers, the atmosphere grew heavier, oxygen masks fogging, sweat freezing and thawing inside flight suits, intercom voices becoming shorter, more functional, because there was no spare energy for anything else. And already several aircraft were flying with only 3 engines, some with control surfaces stiff or partially unresponsive, pilots compensating constantly, trimming and retrimming to hold position, because slipping even a few yards could expose a blind angle. And the strain on crews showed in small ways: delayed callouts, slower reactions at gun positions, gunners having to be reminded to switch ammunition belts or clear minor jams, not because they lacked skill, but because fatigue was cumulative and unavoidable. And the navigators, hunched over charts, recalculated again and again, factoring wind drift and damaged airspeed indicators, trying to keep the formation on a course that balanced distance against danger. Because the shortest route home was not necessarily the safest. Flak belts lay ahead, fighter bases lay ahead, and fuel margins were shrinking faster than planned. And it was during this phase that the mission came closest to unraveling entirely, because the bombers were no longer a single cohesive force, but a collection of battered groups moving together by will as much as by design. And German controllers recognized this, vectoring fighters with precision, rotating fresh units into the fight as earlier attackers returned to refuel and rearm, a luxury the Americans did not have. And so the sky remained hostile, hour after hour, with no clear boundary marking the end of danger. And one of the most dangerous moments came not during a spectacular attack, but during a subtle breakdown in formation discipline, when a group of bombers lagged slightly behind due to uneven engine performance, creating a pocket that drew concentrated attacks, fighters diving through repeatedly, forcing gunners to split attention. And within minutes, several aircraft in that pocket were damaged beyond recovery, some peeling away under control, others losing altitude rapidly, and the remaining bombers surged forward instinctively, closing ranks to protect themselves, a decision that saved some but sealed the fate of others, because stopping to assist was impossible, because circling would invite destruction, and this cold arithmetic of survival weighed heavily on crews who could see damaged aircraft falling behind, could hear distress calls briefly before radios went silent, and still had to keep flying, because the alternative was to join them. And as the formation pressed on, the landscape below changed again. Industrial centers giving way to rolling terrain, rivers winding toward the west, visual confirmation that progress was being made. But the distance remaining was still immense, and the fuel gauges, checked compulsively, told a more worrying story. Needles edging toward reserves, calculations becoming tighter, engineers reporting consumption rates that left little margin for error, especially for aircraft forced to fly at higher power settings to maintain formation speed. And this raised a new layer of risk, because an engine failure now could not be absorbed easily, because the loss of another engine on a 3-engine aircraft could mean a forced descent into enemy territory. And pilots knew it, adjusting throttle movements with extreme care, listening to engines for subtle changes in pitch that might signal impending trouble. And amid all this, the German fighters continued to appear, sometimes in large coordinated groups, sometimes singly or in pairs, harassing relentlessly. And while the bombers' defensive fire did exact a cost, knocking down attackers, forcing some to break off smoking or damaged, the imbalance remained, because every German fighter loss could be replaced quickly, while every American bomber loss represented a crew gone and a gap that could not be filled. And the psychological impact of this asymmetry was profound, though rarely articulated, manifesting instead as a tightening focus on
immediate tasks, on holding altitude, on tracking targets, on staying alive for the next minute, then the next, and the next. And somewhere over Western Germany, the first hints of escort appeared again. Distant shapes climbing toward the bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts returning to meet them for part of the withdrawal, and this sight brought a measurable change. Gunners shifting fire priorities, fighters interposing themselves between bombers and attackers, breaking up some of the pressure. But the relief was partial and temporary, because the escorts could not remain long, because fuel limits applied to them as well, and when they eventually peeled away, the sense of exposure returned immediately, sharper for having briefly eased, and the bombers pressed on, now lower in altitude than planned, because damage and fuel considerations made sustained high-altitude flight difficult, and lower altitude brought its own dangers, increased accuracy from light flak. More visual acquisition by ground observers, and still the German response adapted, attacks shifting angles, using cloud cover when available, exploiting any advantage, and the American crews felt the cumulative toll of this adaptability because there was no pattern that guaranteed safety, only constant vigilance. And as the hours passed, the North Sea finally came within theoretical reach, but even this milestone did not end the danger because fighters continued attacks up to and sometimes beyond the coastline, and because flak belts near the coast could still reach climbing or descending aircraft. And for those bombers that had taken severe damage, reaching the sea did not guarantee survival because fuel might not last across it, because control surfaces might not hold. And so pilots began making quiet calculations about ditching procedures, about which crew positions to evacuate first if necessary, about whether wounded aircraft could be held together long enough to reach land. Calculations made without drama because they had been trained for this, but now carried out under the weight of lived experience. And when the first bombers crossed the coast and turned out over water, the sense of transition was real but fragile because formation disciplines still mattered, because rescue assets depended on known routes and times, and because the sea itself was unforgiving. And as the formation thinned further over water, some aircraft dropping out to attempt solo crossings at more economical speeds, others holding together as long as possible, the mission reached its most precarious phase, not because the enemy pressure was at its peak, but because endurance itself was nearly exhausted, fuel nearly spent, crews nearly depleted, and any new problem, any minor failure could cascade into catastrophe. And this fragility defined the moment, because the mission's success or failure now hinged not on a single decision, but on hundreds of small ones made correctly under extreme fatigue. And as England finally emerged on the horizon for some, a low, dark line beneath cloud, the reality that not all aircraft would make it back became undeniable, because some were already diverting, some already descending toward the sea, and others simply no longer present. And those still flying felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, because landing damaged heavy bombers was itself a hazardous evolution, because fuel exhaustion loomed, and because the final accounting of losses had not yet been made. And as the surviving bombers began their approach sequences, breaking formation as required, lowering landing gear that sometimes refused to deploy fully, feathering engines that had carried them beyond reasonable limits, the mission hovered at the edge of failure and survival simultaneously, because the bombers that landed safely would validate the endurance of the force, but the number that did not would shape the judgment of the operation. And it was in these final minutes, with airfields in sight but not yet beneath their wheels, that the true cost of crossing the point of no return became clear, because nothing could be changed now, and the outcome would be decided by what remained intact after the last engine was shut down. The first wheels touched English runways with a violence that surprised crews who had grown accustomed to vibration and noise, because landing after such duration and damage compressed relief and danger into the same seconds. Tires bursting under uneven loads, brakes grabbing unpredictably, pilots fighting to keep aircraft straight as control responses lagged, and ground crews scattering as bombers rolled in hot, some engines still coughing, some aircraft barely under control. And yet, one by one, the survivors came down, at bases spread across East Anglia that had sent out full squadrons that morning and now received back fragments of them. Aircraft pocked with holes, paint scorched, plexiglass crazed, bomb bay doors sometimes stuck open, crews climbing down slowly, stiff and silent, because the adrenaline that had sustained them aloft drained away almost immediately, replaced by exhaustion so deep it dulled reaction. And as engines shut down and propellers wound to a stop, the scale of the operation began to resolve into numbers and absences, because for every aircraft parked on dispersal, there were others that did not return, and for every crew stepping onto concrete, there were crews whose last moments had been over fields, forests, or water far from home. And while medics moved among the returned aircraft and intelligence officers began their initial debriefs, the larger picture assembled quickly at 8th Air Force headquarters because radio reports, radar tracking, and base tallies confirmed what the planners feared and what the air crews already sensed, that the cost of the mission had been severe, especially for the force that struck Schweinfurt and turned back through the same defended corridors it had entered. And the numbers told a stark story. Dozens of B-17s lost, hundreds of airmen missing or killed, a loss rate that approached levels considered unsustainable even for a force committed to daylight precision bombing. And yet the targets themselves had been hit. Regensburg's Messerschmitt factories damaged enough to disrupt fighter production temporarily. Schweinfurt's ball bearing plant struck hard enough to force dispersion and emergency measures within German industry. And this duality defined the outcome, because the mission achieved its immediate tactical objectives while simultaneously exposing the vulnerability of unescorted deep penetration raids. And within hours, this reality shaped discussion at every level of command, from base operations rooms where squadron leaders accounted for missing crews, to higher headquarters where generals weighed production damage against aircraft losses. And in North Africa, where the Regensburg force landed after its long flight over the Alps and across enemy territory, crews experienced a different but related reckoning, because they had survived the outward leg but now faced the prospect of returning to England after a limited rest, across routes that still lay within reach of the Luftwaffe. And even their arrival did not end a sense of risk, because the mission was not a single sortie but a sequence of commitments that stretched endurance beyond conventional limits. And as the days passed and the intelligence summaries were refined, the strategic implications hardened. Because while German industry proved resilient, adapting and dispersing under pressure, the loss of experienced bomber crews represented an irreplaceable cost in the short term. Training pipelines could not instantly replace men who had learned survival through repeated exposure, and this imbalance forced a reassessment of doctrine, not a retreat from daylight bombing, but a recognition that it could not continue its steps without change. And that change would come in the form of longer-range fighter escort, improved tactics, and the more measured approach to target selection, lessons written not in theory but in the absence of aircraft on dispersal fields and names on missing lists. And the mission of August 1943 thus marked a turning point, not because it failed, but because it clarified the price of persistence. And within weeks, the 8th Air Force would return to Schweinfurt again, applying those lessons imperfectly and at further cost, before finally gaining the tools needed to press deeper with greater protection. And for the men who flew the first long run beyond the point of no return, the memory of that day remained fixed in specific sensations rather than abstract outcomes. The moment escorts peeled away, the steady drum of flak bursts ahead, the sight of fighters growing rapidly larger out of clear sky, the feel of engines straining beyond comfort, and the knowledge, accepted quietly and without drama, that once committed, there was no alternative but to continue forward until either the mission or the aircraft ended. And this understanding, forged at altitude over Germany in the summer of 1943, shaped American air operations for the remainder of the war, anchoring future success in a hard-earned awareness of limits, endurance, and the cost of crossing lines that could not be uncrossed once passed.